President, I rise today in support of Senator Kane's request for unanimous consent for the Senate to pass the Saving the Civil Service Act. It's a critical bill that I hope all my colleagues would agree needs to be enshrined in law. One of the great strengths of our democracy is that we have an independent, merit-based civil service. Back in the 19th century, we saw what happens when you had a federal workforce that was made up of a system of spoils and political patronage. So the Congress back in 1883 said we ought to put in place an independent civil service. That has been the law of the land for the last 150 years. Virtually every other industrial nation in the world has modeled their independent workforce after the American model. We got 2 million federal employees across the country. In Virginia, we got 147,000. There's close to that many in Maryland, many in the district, but they're all over. Senator Hirono mentioned earlier, Hawaii has some of the highest concentration. But Senator Kane's bill, which we're all proud to be co-sponsored on, would simply say, let's not break that system. The idea, and the incoming president has said he wants this, to make and get rid of a merit-based civil service is, in my mind, beyond comprehension. Do you really want that nurse at the VA hospital that the first criteria we're looking for is who'd she vote for, as opposed to whether she knows nursing? Or that air traffic controller that says, well, I may have been politically active for an unpopular candidate, so I'm going to get fired? Or more likely, one of the things that we've seen that's been a strength of our system, the independent economists at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, presidents of each party get mad when their numbers come out each month because those numbers are independently verified. Do you want to fire all those folks and put in political loyalists? The rest of the world would run from that and frankly undermine the reserve nature of the U.S. dollar as the currency of the backbone of the world if we are cooking the books on our economic numbers. There are a host of other examples that we could go almost category by category. I can tell you the vast majority of federal workers that I interact with, most of them could actually have done better in the private sector. They do this work because of that sense of public service. And you get rid of a merit-based system and do it all for political patronage, who's going to actually join that kind of government on a going-forward basis? This would undermine our economy, undermine our security, and obviously undermine the ability of the American people to get a fair administration of government services. With that, I'm going to yield to my good friend, the senator from Maryland, Senator Van Hollen.
Mr. President.
Senator from Maryland.
I want to thank my colleague from Virginia, Senator Warner, who just addressed this very important issue, and my friend and colleague, the other Virginia senator, Senator Kane, who's making the motion today that we pass his Saving Civil Service Act. This is a critical piece of legislation to protect one of America's best innovations, which is the idea of a nonpartisan, merit-based federal workforce, one that serves all Americans regardless of political affiliation, one where you don't take a political test to decide whether you have the credentials for the job. You take a skills-based, knowledge-based test to decide if you're best for the job. Our federal workers are the air traffic controllers who ensure safe passage when Americans fly. They're the inspectors who protect our food supply. They're the folks who determine whether or not medicines put on the market are going to be both safe and do what they say they're going to do. They're the folks at the Social Security Administration in Baltimore City who make sure that people get their Social Security checks on time. They're the nurses and doctors at veterans hospitals who help our veterans, and many, many other essential functions. Today, the only criteria for their employment is performance. It's what they know, not who they know. And they are qualified to serve based on those credentials, and they do a good job protecting the American public. And they serve in those jobs regardless of what president is in the White House and what party that president may belong to. Their duty is to serve the American people. So why are we here on the floor? Because the incoming administration has threatened to change the long-time practice of making sure we have a merit-based civil service. At the very end of the last Trump administration, they proposed something called Schedule F, which would allow them to convert merit-based positions into politically based positions. In other words, substituting political cronies for qualified merit-based federal employees. That is a recipe for corruption. And our predecessors a long time ago recognized that. That's why back in 1883, the Congress passed the Pendleton Act to create the merit-based civil service. Prior to that, we had a spoils system where people who worked on campaigns thought that they could get any job they wanted, regardless of their qualifications, because of their political party label. In fact, the reason we ended up getting the Pendleton Act, one of them was in 1881, one of those people who'd worked on a political campaign and thought they should have gotten a job and didn't, assassinated President Garfield. And so at that time, the country was shaken, and they said, we've got to get rid of the spoil system and replace it with a merit-based system. I want to just make two other points, because the incoming administration, as I said, tried this Schedule F idea at the end of the last administration. This time they're talking about doing it near the beginning of this incoming administration, which is why we're here on the floor today trying to take this action to prevent that from happening. I want to point out that presidents have about 4,000 political positions to fill. So, we're talking about Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State. Presidents have the discretion already, the power today, to nominate people for those 4,000 positions. So we're not talking about taking that away. We're saying you can't convert thousands of other positions that today are based on merit into those political type of jobs. Finally, we've heard a lot about the need for more government efficiency. And count me in. Count all of our colleagues from Virginia and Maryland, and I think probably both sides of the aisle in, on the idea of trying to make sure that we achieve greater efficiencies in government. But I will not support, and we will not support, something that under the cover of the claim of government efficiency is simply a Trojan horse to undo our merit-based system and turn it into one based on political cronyism, because that leads to corruption, which will erode public's confidence and erode the quality of service that our federal civil servants provide. So I want to, again, thank my colleague from Virginia, Senator Kaine, for all he's done. I want to thank my colleague from Maryland, Senator Cardin, who's also been a great partner in this. And with that, I will yield to the senator from Virginia, Senator Kaine.
Mr. President. The senator from Virginia.
Mr. President, I appreciate my colleagues, Senator Warner and Senator Van Hollen. We just had a press conference where Senator Cardin and Senator Hirono also came to speak about the importance of this issue. As everybody knows, you learned this in civics in grade school. Officials in the United States swear loyalty not to the President, but to the Constitution of the United States. And under the Constitution, Congress passes laws and the President enforces them. But from the beginning days of our country, the President can't do all the enforcement and implementation on his or her own. It's too big a job for an individual. In a big and complex country, you need people whose whole job might be enforcing a particular law, say inspecting a meat processing plant. You need people to make sure planes don't crash into each other at airports, people to prosecute anybody running a scam to cheat the elderly out of their life savings, people to bust tax cheats or catch somebody dumping toxic chemicals into a stream in violation of the Clean Water Act. Federal employees do all of these things. They work to ensure critical resources and services are provided in countless communities across America. They work to keep Social Security up and running, manage veterans' benefits, research medical diseases, and develop cures and vaccines. Enforcing the law and running government requires people who are duty-bound to enforce the laws enacted by Congress and to obey the lawful orders of the President, all subject to the overriding duty to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. But we swear fealty to that Constitution, not to a person. Early in the Republic, as my colleague indicated, Senator Van Hollen, the executive branch operated under what's known as the spoils system, as in the expression, to the victor go the spoils. But there quickly arose an obvious problem. If the people who enforce American laws answer only to the president, then if you're on the president's team, they go easy on you. And if you're against the president, they bring federal law down on you like a hammer. That is not the rule of law. It took a century from the founding of America until enactment of the Pendleton Act. And Senator Van Hollen talked about the tragedy, a tragedy that occurred at the foot of Capitol Hill, which was once a train station where President Garfield was assassinated in 1881. And it took that tragedy to basically galvanize this growing awareness that our federal employees should be hired based on merit, not political loyalty. And since then, nearly 150 years, our nation has recognized the value of a nonpartisan and merit-based system to carry out federal government functions. Having a dedicated civil service based on merit rather than political loyalties is in the best interest of everyone. It not only promotes professionalism and reduces cronyism, it also promotes stability. We saw in the last Trump administration the track record of the political appointees. There was a revolving door in many of these positions. How many secretaries of state? How many secretaries of defense? How many secretaries of the Navy? And when you're switching positions out, you get worse and worse quality of service. The professional civil service is not just about merit, it's also about stability. Our civil service is tasked with protecting so many important values: national security, economic productivity, guiding public health, and so much more. There have been attempts in recent years to erode the independence of the federal civil service, and that's why I'm here on the floor, where I will, in a minute, request Senate passage of the Saving the Civil Service Act. The bill upholds the merit system principles to ensure that federal government is equipped with the most qualified and experienced individuals. Specifically, the Saving the Civil Service Act will prohibit the reclassification of federal employees to schedules outside of the competitive civil service without congressional consent. If Congress agrees to this, that's one thing, but to do the reclassification over the objection or without even consulting with Congress would be barred by this bill. Over 2 million federal employees work in all 50 states and U.S. territories. There are 147,000 in Virginia. In New Mexico, there are more than 22,000 federal employees who work in critical areas such as nuclear research. Some of the most important research that's been done in the history of the United States was done in New Mexico by highly trained scientists, and that continues today. In Missouri, where my colleague Senator Schmitt represents, federal employment is more than 37,000, and many work for the VA, for the Treasury, for the Army, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and the Department of Homeland Security. This shouldn't be a partisan bill. We don't have any need and never have had a need for Democratic meat inspectors or Republican air traffic controllers, Democratic VA nurses, and Republican cancer researchers. We just want people who have expertise. These experts may have their personal political opinions, but as long as they're doing their jobs, they deserve protection from political retaliation. To be clear, the president can govern as he or she sees fit within the bounds of statute. Many federal laws have ambiguity. If there's too much ambiguity, we in Congress need to fix it. The president is empowered to use flexibility within the law as he sees fit, and career federal employees have to follow those directives and implement the president's interpretation of the law, falling within legal bounds. And the president additionally has the ability to appoint 4,000 political appointees, some of whom must be confirmed by the Senate, but many of whom don't even require Senate confirmation. If a president tries to go outside the law, and someone should be able to stand up and say, Mr. President, that's illegal and you can't do it. And telling your boss that's illegal and you can't do it is not disloyalty. That's patriotism. That's loyalty to the Constitution and to the law. Again, we all take this same oath. The oath is to the document, not the president. Third and finally, my bill does not mean that we don't expect accountability from federal workers. In any large organization, government agency, or large company, there's a potential for unnecessary bureaucracy to develop. In a large pool of people, there may be some bad apples not doing their job. Nothing in this bill protects federal employees from accountability for their performance. In fact, the National Federation for Federal Employees has testified before Congress on more than one occasion about the circumstances in which federal employees have been terminated for cause. That demonstrates that while they exist to defend the rights of their members, they're not going to apologize for or shirk responsibility for bad behavior of employees whose performance merits termination. I'm all for solutions that increase accountability and efficiency. I'm on the Foreign Relations Committee, and I've followed with great interest the efforts of President Trump's first Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, and his team in 2017 in that space. The rights of civil servants and the goals of an efficient, responsive federal government shouldn't be in competition. And I refuse to dismiss as naive the idea that federal workers can have a range of personal political views but still serve faithfully and carry out the law and the faithful orders of their commander-in-chief. I know this is possible because it's exactly what we ask of the American military. My oldest son is a Marine, and the military delivers that in a significant way. Every service member is allowed to vote, but whoever is duly elected, that's whose lawful orders they follow. The bill is about basic fairness. The American people should have high expectations of federal workers and should know that the people enforcing American laws aren't going easy on somebody just because they happen to be the friend of a president, Democratic or Republican. Some will argue that this is necessary because the federal government is too big and inefficient. In fact, the federal government is smaller today than it was during its peak in the post-World War II years, with more than 3 million federal employees at that time. So I am looking forward to working on this and making sure that we uphold this value that has stood the test of time since 1883, professional civil service, not one based on political loyalty or cronyism. And with that, Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the Committee on Homeland Security and Government Affairs be discharged from further consideration of S-399, and the Senate proceed to its immediate consideration, that the bill be considered read a third time and passed, and that the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there objection?
Mr. President,
Senator from Missouri.
reserving my right to object. I am heartened to hear the historical references from my friend from Virginia and my friend from Maryland, but if we go back just a little bit further to our nation's founding, the founders were very concerned about concentrations of power. That's why we have federalism, our system of federalism. We have 3 branches of government. The separation of powers, all was meant to disperse government so that no one branch, no one person ever got too powerful, with the underlying belief that what would save this system of self-government was that people would be accountable to the people. That if you sent somebody up here and you agreed with them, you'd send them back or you'd send them home. What we have seen, particularly in the last 100 years, is a growth of an administrative state that isn't accountable to anybody. That's the truth. I was in Northwest Missouri a couple years ago, and a farmer told me, Eric, I just don't ever remember voting for the Deputy Undersecretary of the EPA. And he had a point, that a guidance letter, not even a rule, and certainly not even a law, can destroy a farmer's livelihood in a farm they've had for generations. Or take, for example, the abuses we saw during COVID. The Supreme Court, I know something about this, I was the AG that brought the case, the vaccine mandate. They didn't have any authority to force a medical procedure on 100 million people, but they wanted to do it anyway. Student loan debt forgiveness. There was no authority to wipe away $500 billion worth of student loan debt with a stroke of a pen, but they did it anyway. And these are big, broad discussions. The Supreme Court's weighed in. The major questions doctrine. They have been reining in the abuses of government now and unelected bureaucrats over the last decade, and of course with the overturning of the Chevron decision, the ball's now in our court to sort of reassert the Article I branch's role. That we're the ones, if you want to ban gas stoves, we should have to vote on it. And so this bill, what it does, it blatantly infringes upon executive prerogative to shape the executive workforce. So the courts have weighed in, and dare I say, the American people weighed in just about a month ago. There is no secret that President Trump ran on greater government efficiency in reducing the size of government. This is another effort to Trump-proof before January 20th. We're seeing a wholesale auction of the border wall for less than 1% of its value. It's happening right now to thwart what's coming. These sort of efforts that are happening behind the scenes and now here on the Senate floor are intended to do one thing, which is to prevent President Trump from executing on what he campaigned on, which is government efficiency. About 16% of the federal workforce right now is in any one of those buildings on Pennsylvania Avenue. I think over the coming months, with the DOGE committee and some of those efforts, and I hope we can work in a bipartisan way. I agree, this shouldn't be a partisan issue. Saving money should not be a partisan issue. And there are some people that probably need to go. There are great federal workers in our federal workforce. But we are wasting a lot of money, and people aren't even willing to show up to work right now. So, having flexibility to deliver on the message that people saw across their television screens and in rallies all across this country over the last 2 years during a presidential campaign, that's what this is about. This bill would thwart those efforts, and that is why, Mr. President, I'm objecting. So therefore, I object.
Objection is heard.
Mr. President.
Senator from Virginia.
Just a brief response. My colleague from Missouri mentioned the fact that recent decisions of the Supreme Court have put more burden on the shoulders of Congress, not to abdicate decision-making responsibility, but to own it. And that's precisely what my bill would do. It would not block a president from trying to make reforms to the federal civil service. It would just require that the president do so in consultation with the Article I branch. And that Article I branch, come January 3rd, is going to be 2 Republican houses. I can't imagine why a Trump presidency would be afraid of 2 Republican houses if any proposal with respect to the federal civil service has merit. It would seem that the president should have some sense of confidence that he could convince the next Congress of the United States to go along with it. But if, in fact, he's worried about his ability to convince 2 Republican houses to go along with plans with respect to the federal civil service, I think that should tell us something. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor, and I note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.